you became the most famous scientist in Ireland during a period where there was wide-scale global collapse. How did that affect you emotionally and personally?
But it was the strangest thing. For a scientist to be recognized in the street, I thought, what's going on here?
Yeah,
Something that we're not used to, obviously, you know. What it was for, it's still happening, by the way. People still come up to me. It's quite nice, you know. And it's 99% positive. They thank me for the information I gave out, you know.
yeah,
I guess at the time it was just very intense, is my main memory of it. It was every day. I was doing lots of stuff for News Talk and RT and all kinds of things. And it wasn't just me, Evan, as you know, many of my colleagues were doing it too. So there was a
of
group of
course.
us. And it was very rewarding in the end, actually, because people were very grateful. And my job, as you know, is to get information out there anyway, either through
Yeah,
my lectures or my research or my conferences and all these kinds of things. I didn't see it any different to my day job really, but it was just pretty intense. And the big fear was that I get it wrong. That was something
yeah,
that would worry me slightly, you know,
yeah, of course.
because obviously as a scientist you want to get the facts right, and especially when there's such a focus on you. You know, if you got something wrong, that'll be bad. So it was hard work, I guess, as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you were clearly the right man for the job then, because I know you've been a scientific communicator your whole life, but I would expect that the level of escalation in your viewership, in the amount of people that were basically at your beck and call, listening at every word, really in a situation where everyone was in such uncertainty. I mean, even scientists, right? I mean, did you experience anything novel and challenging in that? Because it's got to be a lot different to what you've experienced in the past. I mean, a lot different for everybody.
I was doing it before anyway, but as you know, I was on News Talk since 2013, in fact, with a science slot with Pat Kenny. So I was kind of well used to it at one level. But of
Yeah.
course, in this situation, I became very aware that people were listening to every word. They were very frightened, especially older people. People over
Yeah.
60 were especially scared, you know. And suddenly I began to realize they've got a big responsibility now because I wanted to help. My mission is to help, remember, and to get the information out there and keep people informed. And the bottom line, of course, was science will get us through this, which is what happened, as we know. And we all knew that would be the case. And I realized eventually it was about giving people hope. And that was very different from me talking about some breakthrough in Alzheimer's disease or whatever it might be, even though that does have a hope aspect as well.
Yeah.
This was exponentially more important. And then I realized as well that other people, other experts, were slightly more glass half empty kind of approach, which is fine. As scientists, you've got to be honest, you know. And
Yeah.
I knew that maybe I could counter that slightly and say, look, it is tough. And I never tried to sugarcoat it. I'd say, look, there's tough things happening, but we will get through it. That was my overarching message was science is great, which it always is. That's always the message
Yes.
I give anyway, you know. And this is a way to win it. Now, I was worried, but I mean, the vaccine could have taken a lot longer. Certainly, by the time we get to June, July of 2020, there were no guarantees, you know. And I knew that, and I thought, good Lord, this could go on for a long time now unless we get this
Yeah.
breakthrough that we're looking for. And then we get to November, never forget it, and Pfizer announced its top line trial data. And I actually shed a tear because I realized this is the beginning of the end, as it were, because I knew
Yeah.
that we were going to get out of it. So that was all very, you're right. The word emotion definitely comes into it because it was a very fraught time.
It has to. Like I joke that there wasn't an Irish mammy that didn't know your name and have a newly minted immunology degree following you on the radio, which I was very upset with my mom because I've been talking to her about science for years and she never seemed to care. She never seemed to
No,
listen to me.
no.
And then
Yeah,
as soon as you were talking on the radio, she was like, I have to get my Professor Luke now. He's gonna tell me how the pandemic is going on. I was like,
yeah.
I've been talking to you about science for years, ma'am.
It's taken a long time. Well, that just shows you, again, it was the emotional connection is what happened there, you see. You can talk about stuff about science in the media a lot, and you don't really connect with most people
Yeah.
unless it's emotional. And if someone has a disease, they'll be very interested in what you're saying, you know.
Yeah.
In this case, everybody was at risk of this. The whole world was at risk of a very serious disease. So therefore, they were all plugged into it, and they were reacting then in an emotional way as well as in a hopefully in a rational way, which is what the goal of it was anyway, to make people respond in a reasonable way as well.
Yeah. Were you thinking in any way purposely that this is a different form of scientific communication, that your role was decidedly different now in the next year or so, as someone who, I don't know if you volunteered, you were the right person for the job, but everyone sort of went to you for that advice, and I think you were absolutely the right man for it. But did you consciously think that this is distinctly different to what I've done in the past? The weight of this responsibility is larger, the uncertainty is larger, the amount of fear, the amount of widespread its importance to this information. Was that a conscious thing that you sort of registered?
It wasn't really, I was too busy doing it, first of all. I mean,
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
full on. I was on Pat Kenny 3 days a week on the radio. for 30 minutes at a time sometimes, Evan. And normally I'm on for
Yeah.
10 minutes, you know. And then secondly, I'd be on RTE as well. I was on many news outlets. I was on CNN. I made America. I was on CNN in America.
Yeah.
So it was full on more than anything else. My memory of it is a very, as I say, very busy, intense time. It ramped up my approach would have been before. Find something new, get the facts out, and that I've been doing that for years anyway. But of course, this is the most relevant biomedical story in the past 100 years. I became very conscious of that pretty quickly myself. And remember,
Yeah.
I'm in the thick of it as well, and I'm worrying about vaccines. I want to know what's going to happen. I'm
Yeah.
watching all the numbers like everybody was. My own lab began to work on COVID, of course, pretty quickly because many labs switched into COVID research, and
Yeah.
we worked on the more therapeutic side. We don't work on vaccines. We work on anti-inflammatories, as you may know, and the more therapeutic kind of thing. So my lab had 5 people working on the disease. Can you
Yeah.
believe it? That added
Yeah.
an extra huge relevance to what I was doing. So that was all in the mix as well. And I think, but again, the big difference here was people were scared. And I realized that my job was to try to reassure them overall. And that wouldn't be the case normally when you're doing science communication. You wouldn't be trying to reassure people.
Exactly.
You,
Yeah.
you might be telling people, oh, there might be potentially a treatment for a disease. There's some brand new discovery here that's interesting scientifically. That message is about science anyway and the scientific process. But this was a different thing entirely. You know?
Yeah. I'm curious to hear more on that process of how you do change the area of research. So you could be looking at something quite differently. Obviously, you specialize in anti-inflammatories and the mechanism of inflammation. So there's a lot of parallels there. Your lab scientist would have been very well versed in that literature, a very good understanding of that biochemistry. But talk me through that process of how you do that pivot. You always talk about pivots
Yeah.
in business where you change your idea, but there isn't many pivots in science that would happen that rapidly. At least that would be my understanding. I'm curious to hear more about that process.
Yeah, there was only say a slight pivot. So what we work on in my lab is inflammation in the broadest sense. Now, inflammation happens
Yeah.
if you've got a tissue injury, if you sprain your ankle, that gets inflamed. But it also happens during infection. And I had worked on things like bacterial infections. I'd worked on viruses in the past. I worked on vaccinia, which is the vaccine for smallpox, for instance. I'd done collaborations with people on things like hepatitis C. So I was in the area anyway, you know?
Yeah.
And therefore, it wasn't that difficult to switch. The big thing I work on are inflammatory cytokines, as you may remember. And
Yeah.
they were up in COVID. And they're the things that cause some of the damage in COVID. That became clear. We knew anyway that cytokines are problematic during infections. Like, for example, one big thing we do is sepsis and septic shock. Now, that is a bacterial infection. But it's your own cytokines that are harming you, you know, exactly the same in COVID. So I knew that. I said, right, let's switch into COVID now, you know. And so, for example, instead of adding a bacteria to our experiments, we added a virus. And we had a collaboration with a big lab in Sydney who were working on COVID. We couldn't work on COVID here because it's a P3 pathogen. But my collaborator in Sydney had it in his lab, and I'd be sending him samples. He'd be measuring various possible therapeutic angles in his lab and sending data back to me. So
Yeah.
we began to work on it pretty
Great.
quickly in the end. So it wasn't that difficult to switch into it. And then the second thing I'd say is we were also working on coagulation strategy. Now the blood will clot during infection, and that to trap the bug. Actually, the main reason the blood clots is you want to wall off the bacteria or indeed the virus and stop it spreading in your body. You know, and
Hmm.
that became part of COVID, a coagulopathy. And my student at the time, Tristram Ryan, he began working on COVID and coagulation. So again, it wasn't a huge leap to switch into it. Now, I
Yeah.
couldn't have switched into vaccines because I don't work on those. They're not my expertise. I
Yeah.
think many labs like mine, they said, oh, look, I have a skill set here. I have an interest in a certain area. I can now apply that to COVID quite readily, if
Yeah.
it's possible to apply. In my case, it was, you know, and that's all that happened, really.
Yeah. It's probably an underestimated point that I don't know if the general population really understand how much overlap there is in a lot of these viruses. When they have distinct names, they can often be thought of being completely distinct. But it's interesting that you were able to quite easily pivot into it because the pathways down, once you get
Yeah.
down to the molecular levels, there's quite a lot of overlap.
There is overlap, exactly, yes. And my
Yeah.
other big area of research is called innate immunity. And innate immunity are the built-in defenses in your body. And several of those sense viruses. And we'd worked on those. We'd worked on one called TLR3, TLR7. These are awful things. But they sense viruses. I'd done stuff on those 15, 20 years ago. And not COVID. Hadn't come along yet, you know. So
Yeah.
like a massive amount of overlap in the immune system in terms of some of the common features.
Yeah.
Of course, what's fascinating is there's specificities and differences as well.
Yeah.
And we know that SARS-CoV-2 has certain differences to other coronaviruses for a start, you know. And the big one we worry about, Evan, is long COVID. That's the thing that's emerged very clearly now. That
Yeah.
seems especially prone to driving these persistent symptoms. You do see it with other viruses, like post-flu fatigue and so on, but this seems especially problematic, and that's something that may be a bit different. So there are similarities and differences.
If you enjoyed that short podcast clip, then I'm so confident you will enjoy even more the full conversation. You can click it here. Click it. Come on. You know you want to. Click it.